Hello, all. Today, for our second day of 365 Days of Psychology, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of psychology. So, remember, we are using 365 Days of Psychology by Daily, which was published in 2024 as a this project is loosely based on that book. So, the history of psychology was based upon philosophy. So our first research studies were about sensation, perception, and reaction times. So if you think about the history of the world, we hear a lot about ancient philosophers and their thoughts on the things that they did. And so I joke with my students that before psychology, before science added or became psychology, what we used to do is we would have typically these uh, older male, sometimes female, we don't talk about this as often, but philosophers who would kind of step out and make these proclamations. I think that humans are born with innate knowledge, and then they would go back into their homes, and people would go, "Oh yes, very interesting. He knows so much." And so we came out with all of these ideas. There were all these philosophy thoughts regarding human behavior and why we behave as we do. And then what we started to do is actually add some science into it. And so the first types of research studies that actually applied the scientific method, just like you use in your biology and your chemistry classes, to these philosophical thoughts were related to how do our senses work? How do we perceive the information that we've sensed? How quickly do we react to stimuli? So we've moved from this speculation of, I wonder why people do this, or here's an idea of why people do this, to science. And that science has an impact on all walks of life. So, why should we study the history of psychology? Studying the history of psychology can help us understand the current themes in psychology and where they came from. So, the history of psychology kind of builds upon itself. So we had the behaviorists who came out and said, we think that the only thing that should be studied is observable behavior, and we're not as much interested in cognitions and the things that are going on in that mind thing of yours. And then the cognitivists came along and said, excuse me, no, it is important what's going on up here, and we want to study memory and sleep processes and all that sort of stuff. And then other folks came along after there was more developments in science, and they said, hey, we actually have these machines where you can see the brain. And so we want to study the brain and what the brain's doing while humans are doing different psychological things. So everything kind of built upon previous research, previous thoughts, previous experiences within psychology. And so that's why it's useful and interesting for us to study the history of psychology. It can also, to be completely honest with you, and I'm a psych geek, so there you go. But it can just be interesting. So, for example, did you know that historically we used to think that we could tell your personality traits by feeling the bumps on your skull? It's what we call phrenology. If you look in this image over here on the cover of The Story of Psychology by Morton Hunt, that image actually related to phrenology. And so people thought that we could tell your personality based upon like what bumps you had on your head. That did you know that everyone's favorite psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud, was a chronic cocaine user? Don't worry, it used to be legal at his time. So if you're interested in learning more about these sorts of things, then I highly suggest you check out The Story of Psychology by Morton Hunt. It's a really useful book to learn about psych history. And also, if you're going to be going to graduate school for psychology, I do suggest, if it's available to you, that you take a course in the history of psychology, because as I explained before, these history of psychology courses will really walk us through the different time periods and what people thought about how the brain worked and how people interacted and things like that. And our new stuff is influenced by what was previously studied, and maybe it's influenced by, we've studied what was previously studied and what we thought was previously true, and we've come to realize, yeah, not so much. It's not actually true anymore. So today has been our second day of Psych 365, 365 days of studying psychology. We talked a little bit today about why we should study the history of psychology, and that the history of psychology was based upon philosophy. I'll see you tomorrow.